In a divided town, Evelyn Carter inherits her family's farm, only to face suspicion and hostility as a black woman stepping into her new role. Accused of stealing her own products, she fights to prove her place and transform Ridgeway Farms into a beacon of hope, uniting a community through resilience, hard work, and unwavering grace. Write in the comment where you watching this video from. Evelyn Carter stared out at the land stretching before her, her grandfather's farm bathed in the soft light of a winter sunrise. Ridgeway Farms was more than a collection of fields and barns. It was her family's legacy. Generations of Carters had worked this land, their hands tending the soil and raising livestock that fed the town of Pinewood. To Evelyn, it was sacred ground. The farm had been her sanctuary during childhood summers. She remembered running through the pastures, her small feet kicking up dust as her grandfather, Henry Carter, called after her, his laughter mingling with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. He'd been a towering figure in her life, his deep voice steady with wisdom. "This land's in your blood, Evie," he'd told her one evening as they sat on the porch. "You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." Back then, Evelyn had believed those words without question. Ridgeway Farms seemed eternal, as constant as the sun rising over the hills. But life had a way of pulling her in other directions. She'd left Pinewood for college, earning a degree in agricultural science, and later built a successful career in a bustling city hundreds of miles away. She visited her grandfather as often as she could, but as the years passed, her trips became fewer. Everything changed the day she received the call. Her grandfather had passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving Evelyn as the sole heir to Ridgeway Farms. Returning to Pinewood for the funeral had been surreal, a bittersweet homecoming filled with memories of a simpler time. The farmhouse, once lively with her grandfather's presence, felt too quiet. The weight of loss was heavy, but so was the responsibility that came with it. Evelyn had made the decision to stay. She couldn't bear the thought of selling the farm, of letting the Carter family legacy slip away. Instead, she left her city life behind and took on the challenge of running Ridgeway Farms. It wasn't an easy transition. The farm had seen better days, and there was no shortage of skeptics in town. Henry Carter was a good man, one supplier had told her early on, his tone skeptical. "But running a farm like this is no small thing, Miss Carter. Are you sure you're up for it?" Evelyn had smiled politely, masking her irritation. "I appreciate your concern," she'd replied, "but I think I'll manage." She threw herself into the work, determined to honor her grandfather's memory. She modernized the farm's operations, investing in new equipment and sustainable practices. She expanded their livestock breeding program, ensuring the quality of the farm's prized pork remained unmatched. Slowly but surely, Ridgeway Farms began to thrive again. But not everyone in Pinewood was ready to embrace Evelyn as the farm's new owner. She was a black woman in a role that had traditionally been occupied by white men, and her confidence and competence made her a target for thinly veiled hostility. Some of the town's older residents, accustomed to dealing with her quiet, unassuming grandfather, resented her directness. Others, like Mr. Paulson, the town butcher, seemed uncomfortable with her very presence. Despite the challenges, Evelyn refused to back down. Ridgeway Farms was hers, and she intended to prove it. Now, as Christmas approached, the farm was busier than ever. The annual shipment of hams, a holiday tradition started by her grandfather, had been sent to Paulson's butcher shop the previous week. The hams were a Pinewood staple, gracing the tables of families across the town each Christmas. Evelyn had taken extra care with this year's batch, ensuring they lived up to the Carter name. She was heading to the butcher shop this morning to check on the delivery. It was a simple errand, but one she took seriously. Her grandfather had always said, "You don't just do the work. You show people the work matters." As Evelyn pulled into town, memories of her childhood visits resurfaced. Pinewood hadn't changed much in her absence. The same storefronts lined the streets, their windows decorated with garlands and twinkling lights. The same church bells rang out each hour, a familiar melody that seemed to echo across time. But as she parked her truck and stepped onto the sidewalk, Evelyn felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her. She nodded politely at a passing couple, who returned her greeting with tight-lipped smiles. She wasn't a stranger here, but she wasn't entirely welcome either. Not yet. The butcher shop was bustling when Evelyn entered, the air warm and fragrant with the smell of smoked meats. Mr. Paulson stood behind the counter, his burly frame hunched over a ledger. He glanced up as she approached, his expression neutral. "Morning, Mr. Paulson," Evelyn said with a polite smile. "I just wanted to check on the hams. Everything going smoothly?" Paulson hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the display case. "They're fine," he said curtly. "Anything else?" Before Evelyn could respond, a sharp voice cut through the chatter of the shop. "Excuse me, miss," a woman said, her tone accusatory. "What were you doing near the hams?" Evelyn turned to see a middle-aged woman glaring at her, one hand clutching a shopping bag. The shop fell silent as the other customers turned to watch. "Are you accusing me of something?" Evelyn asked, keeping her voice steady. "Well, I don't know," the woman said, her tone laced with suspicion. "You don't exactly look like you belong here." The words hung in the air like a slap. Evelyn felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She straightened, her voice calm but firm. "I own Ridgeway Farms," she said. "The hams you're pointing at came from my livestock." The woman scoffed. "You own Ridgeway Farms?" "I don't think so." Evelyn turned to Paulson, her gaze steady. "Mr. Paulson, would you like to clarify where these hams came from?" Paulson opened his mouth, then closed it, his discomfort clear. Well, they're from Ridgeway Farms," he mumbled finally. Evelyn turned back to the woman. "Satisfied?" The woman flushed, muttering something under her breath before turning away. Evelyn felt the eyes of the shop on her as she walked to the counter. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Paulson," she said, her voice measured. "I'll let you get back to work." As Evelyn stepped outside, the cold air bit at her cheeks, but it felt refreshing after the stifling tension of the shop. She stood for a moment, letting the anger dissipate. She had learned long ago not to let moments like this define her. She had work to do, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. Evelyn drove back to Ridgeway Farms, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The accusation at the butcher shop replayed in her mind, the sharpness of the woman's voice ringing in her ears. It wasn't the first time she had been confronted with suspicion or disrespect since taking over the farm, but this was different. This was public and humiliating. The driveway to the farm curved through a grove of pine trees, opening to the wide expanse of pastures and the cluster of red barns that formed the heart of Ridgeway Farms. Her employees were hard at work, tending to the animals and preparing shipments for the holidays. Evelyn parked her truck and stepped out, drawing in a deep breath of the crisp, clean air. This was her sanctuary, her anchor in a world that often felt unsteady. "Miss Evelyn," a voice called out. Turning, she saw Marcus, her farm manager, striding toward her. Marcus had worked for her grandfather for decades and had stayed on after Evelyn inherited the farm. He was as much a part of Ridgeway Farms as the land itself, and his loyalty had been a steadying force in her transition. "You all right?" Marcus asked, his brow furrowed. "You look upset." Evelyn hesitated, then sighed. "Had an incident at the butcher shop. A woman accused me of trying to steal one of our hams." Marcus's expression darkened. "What? That's ridiculous." "She didn't even try to hide what it was really about," Evelyn said, her voice tight. "Didn't think someone like me could own this place." Marcus shook his head, his frustration mirroring her own. "This town. Some folks still stuck in the past. But don't let 'em get to you, Miss Evelyn. You've earned your place here." Evelyn nodded, grateful for his support. "Thanks, Marcus. I just needed to vent." "Anytime," Marcus said, tipping his hat before heading back to the barn. Later that afternoon, Evelyn sat at her desk in the farmhouse, poring over financial records and shipment schedules. The farm was thriving, but keeping it that way required meticulous attention to detail. As she worked, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Will Harris, the young journalist she had met at the butcher shop. "Will, hi, Miss Carter. I hope I'm not bothering you, but I wanted to follow up on what happened this morning." I think it's something the town should know about. Evelyn stared at the message, her emotions mixed. Part of her wanted to forget the incident, to push it aside and focus on her work. But another part of her, one that had grown louder in recent years, knew this was an opportunity to confront the prejudice head-on. Evelyn, thanks, Will. I appreciate your concern. I'd be happy to talk, but let's meet at the farm. I want you to see what we do here. Will's reply came quickly. Will, absolutely. Tomorrow work for you? Evelyn, come by at 10. The next morning, Will arrived promptly at 10, his notebook and camera in hand. He was a sharp, enthusiastic young man with a genuine curiosity that Evelyn appreciated. Thanks for inviting me, Will said as Evelyn led him toward the main barn. I've heard about Ridgeway Farms, but I didn't realize how big it was. It's a lot of work, Evelyn said, smiling. But it's worth it. This place has been in my family for generations. Will began asking questions, and Evelyn answered thoughtfully, weaving the story of the farm's history with her own experiences as its owner. She showed him the livestock pens, the feed storage, and the state-of-the-art equipment she had invested in to modernize operations. What's been the hardest part of taking over? Will asked as they walked through the pasture. Evelyn paused, considering her answer. Honestly, proving that I belong here. People in this town respected my grandfather, but some of them don't know what to make of me. I'm not what they expect. Will nodded, jotting notes. What do you want people to know about you? About Ridgeway Farms. Evelyn looked out over the fields, the wind stirring her hair. That this place isn't just mine, it's ours. It's part of this community. Everything we do here is about creating something good for Pinewood. I just want people to see that. The article appeared in the Pinewood Gazette a few days later, under the headline, A New Era at Ridgeway Farms. Evelyn Carter's vision for the future. Will's piece painted a vivid picture of the farm's history, Evelyn's dedication, and the challenges she faced as a black woman in a role steeped in tradition. The article sparked immediate reactions. At the local diner, conversations buzzed around the tables. I didn't know she'd done so much with the place, one man said, flipping through the paper. That's impressive. Another patron, an older woman, frowned. Still doesn't mean she should have been accused like that. She's got more claim to that ham than anyone in this town. But not everyone was supportive. At a corner table, a group of older residents muttered among themselves. She's just trying to make us feel sorry for her, one man grumbled. That farm's too big for her to handle. She'll run it into the ground. The backlash wasn't limited to whispers. That evening, as Evelyn locked up the barn, she noticed something strange. One of the farm's signs near the road had been vandalized. The words "Go Home" scrawled across it in red paint. Her chest tightened, but she refused to let fear or anger consume her. Instead, she called Marcus and a few other employees. Together, they scrubbed the sign clean, their determination stronger than ever. They're just scared of what you're building, Marcus said as they worked. Don't let them win. The following week, Evelyn attended a town hall meeting to address community concerns. She was nervous but resolute, determined to show the town she wasn't going anywhere. The room was packed, the atmosphere tense. Some residents praised Evelyn for her work, while others voiced skepticism about her leadership. Paulson, the butcher, sat near the back, avoiding her gaze. When Evelyn took the floor, she spoke with quiet strength. I understand that change can be uncomfortable, she began. But Ridgeway Farms isn't about changing Pinewood. It's about building on what my grandfather started. This farm has always been part of this community, and it always will be. Her words were met with scattered applause, but the tension in the room didn't entirely dissipate. As Evelyn left the meeting, Will caught up with her. You handled that well, he said. But this isn't just about the farm, is it? No, Evelyn said. It's about more than that. It's about who gets to belong here. As Evelyn drove back to the farm that night, the weight of the day settled over her. She thought of her grandfather, of the countless challenges he had faced but rarely spoken about. She thought of the land they had both loved, the legacy she was determined to protect. Turning into the driveway, She saw the farmhouse lights glowing warmly against the dark. It was a reminder of why she fought so hard. This was her home, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. The morning after the town hall meeting, Evelyn woke early, her mind still buzzing with the events of the previous day. She hadn't expected the room to be filled with warmth and welcome. This wasn't a fairy tale. But the cold stares from some of the town's older residents and the murmurs of doubt from those who refused to accept her presence still stung. As sunlight streamed through the curtains of her bedroom, Evelyn glanced at the framed photo on her bedside table. It was her favorite picture of her grandfather, Henry Carter, taken years ago. He was standing in front of the barn, a weathered hat tilted on his head and a broad smile lighting up his face. His pride in the farm had been palpable, and Evelyn had promised herself she would carry that pride forward, no matter what. At the farm, the day began as usual. Marcus and the crew were already in the barns, tending to the animals and preparing shipments for the upcoming week. Evelyn stepped into the main barn, where Marcus was giving instructions to 2 new employees. "Morning, Miss Evelyn," Marcus said, tipping his hat. "Everything's running smooth today. Got the new feed order in too." "Thanks, Marcus," Evelyn replied, her voice steady but distracted. She hesitated, then added, "Do you think we're making progress? Not just here, but with the town?" Marcus paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "Progress? Yeah, I think so. But folks don't change overnight. Some people are stubborn, and others just need time to see what you're really about." Evelyn nodded, though the weight of doubt lingered. "Time," she murmured. "I hope that's all it takes." Later that morning, Evelyn received a call from Will Harris. "Morning, Miss Carter," Will said, his voice energetic. "I just wanted to give you a heads up. I'm working on a follow-up to the article about the farm, focusing on the response after the town hall meeting." Evelyn hesitated. "Will, I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't want this to turn into a spectacle. The farm speaks for itself." "I understand," Will said. "But the farm story is part of a bigger conversation. People need to see what you're doing here, to see the progress, the hard work. The town's changing, whether everyone likes it or not." Evelyn sighed. "All right, Will. Just make sure the story focuses on the farm, not the drama." "Of course," Will assured her. "I'll come by tomorrow for some new photos, if that's okay?" "Fine. See you then." In town, the fallout from the town hall meeting continued to ripple through Pinewood. At the diner, conversations buzzed between bites of pancakes and sips of coffee. "She's got guts. I'll give her that," one man said, his voice carrying across the room. "Standing up in front of everyone like that. Guts don't make her qualified," an older woman muttered. "That farm's too much for her. You'll see. She'll run it into the ground." Across the room, Will overheard the exchange. He had stopped in for breakfast before heading to a nearby farm for another story, but the ongoing chatter about Evelyn caught his attention. He jotted down a few notes, his mind racing with ideas for the follow-up article. At the counter, an elderly man named Tom spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "I knew Henry Carter. Worked alongside him for years when I was younger. He was a good man, and if he left that farm to his granddaughter, it's because he knew she could handle it. Some of y'all need to remember that." The room fell quiet for a moment before the buzz of conversation resumed. Will smiled to himself, feeling a glimmer of hope. Not everyone in Pinewood was stuck in the past. Meanwhile, Evelyn decided to address the vandalism at the farm head-on. She contacted a local sign maker and commissioned a new sign to replace the one that had been defaced. The new design would include the Ridgeway Farms logo alongside the words, "Established by Henry Carter, sustained by Evelyn Carter." When the sign was delivered a few days later, Evelyn gathered her employees to help install it at the farm's entrance. As they worked, Marcus glanced at the bold lettering and smiled. "They're going to see this from the road and know exactly who's running this place," he said. "That's the idea," Evelyn replied, a hint of pride in her voice. The new sign became a symbol of resilience. Cars slowed as they passed the farm, some drivers nodding in approval, others scowling but saying nothing. Evelyn took each reaction as a reminder of the work still to be done. The next day, Will arrived at the farm with his camera, ready to capture the essence of Ridgway Farms for his follow-up story. Evelyn greeted him at the entrance, her demeanor calm but purposeful. "Let's start with the livestock," Evelyn said, leading him toward the pastures. "I want people to see the heart of this operation." Wolf followed, snapping photos as Evelyn explained the farm's breeding program, feed practices, and plans for expansion. Her passion for the work was evident in every word, her knowledge of agriculture shining through. "What's been the biggest challenge since taking over?" Will asked, lowering his camera. "Proving I belong here," Evelyn said without hesitation. "I know I'm good at this work. I've studied it, lived it, and poured my heart into it. But some people can't see past their assumptions. They see me and they don't see a farmer. They see an outsider." Will nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think the town will ever fully accept you?" Evelyn paused, considering her answer. "I think acceptance is a two-way street. I'm here to stay, and I'm willing to work for it. But the town has to meet me halfway." Will's article was published the following week, under the headline, "Ridgway Farms: Tradition, Resilience, and a Vision for the Future." The piece delved into the farm's operations, Evelyn's dedication, and the ongoing tension in Pinewood. It highlighted the farm as both a source of pride and a catalyst for change. The article sparked another wave of reactions. At the local grocery store, customers chatted about the story while browsing the produce aisle. "I didn't realize how much she's done with the place," one woman said, holding a copy of the paper. "She's impressive. But she's stirring things up," another customer said. "Not everyone's ready for that." At Ridgway Farms, the phone began ringing off the hook. Some calls were from supportive locals wanting to buy products directly from the farm. Others were less kind, with anonymous callers leaving cryptic messages of disapproval. Evelyn handled each situation with grace, leaning on her employees and supporters for strength. As the weeks passed, Evelyn began to notice subtle shifts in the town's attitude. A few longtime residents stopped by the farm to buy pork or eggs, their initial wariness giving way to curiosity. Paulson, the butcher, even began referring customers directly to Ridgway Farms when he ran out of stock. A small but meaningful gesture. But not everyone was ready to change. Late one evening, as Evelyn walked the perimeter of the farm to check the fences, she spotted a figure lingering near the road. The person turned and ran as soon as she called out, disappearing into the darkness. The incident left her shaken, but she refused to let fear take root. The next morning, she called a meeting with her employees. "We're not just running a farm," she said, her voice steady. "We're standing for something bigger. If we keep doing the work and showing people what we're about, they'll have no choice but to see us." Marcus nodded. "And if they don't, we'll still be here." The morning sun hung low over Pinewood as Evelyn sat at her desk, her notebook open to a list of upcoming tasks for the farm. The rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall was the only sound in the room. Outside, the familiar hum of machinery and animal calls filled the air. Ridgway Farms was alive with the pulse of daily work, but Evelyn's mind wandered elsewhere. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze falling on an old photograph propped up on the bookshelf. It was a black and white image of her grandfather standing with a group of men, all dressed in work clothes, their faces lined with wear and grit. The photo had been taken during the farm's early days, back when Ridgway was still finding its footing in a town reluctant to see a black man succeed. Evelyn thought back to the stories her grandfather had shared. He rarely spoke about the overt racism he faced, but when he did, the pain was clear. She remembered him telling her about the day he'd bought Ridgway Farms, how the previous owner had sold it reluctantly after no other bidders showed up. "They didn't think I'd last a year," her grandfather had said, his voice calm but firm. "But I showed them." Those words echoed in Evelyn's mind as she prepared for the day. She'd inherited more than land. She'd inherited his determination. The tension in Pinewood had grown more pronounced since Will's second article was published. Conversations in town were charged, and Evelyn often felt the weight of whispers as she walked through the grocery store, or picked up supplies at the hardware shop. While many townsfolk were beginning to warm to her presence, others clung stubbornly to their skepticism. At the local coffee shop, a group of older residents gathered near the corner table, their voices low but sharp. "She's too ambitious," said Mr. Carlyle, a retired farmer who had lived in Pinewood his entire life. Ridgeway was a quiet, reliable farm when Henry ran it. Now it's all about expansion and headlines. "She's trying to change too much, too fast," another man muttered. "You see that sign she put up? It's like she's rubbing it in our faces." Mrs. Avery, a woman known for her sharp tongue, chimed in. "It's not just the sign. Did you see that article? Acting like she's the savior of this town. Some people don't know their place." Their comments drew nods from a few others at the table, though not everyone joined in. Tom, the elderly man who had spoken in Evelyn's defense at the diner, sipped his coffee quietly, his expression thoughtful. "You can talk all you want," Tom said finally, his voice cutting through the chatter. "But that woman's got guts. Henry would have been proud." The table fell silent, and the group soon dispersed, their murmurs trailing out the door. Back at Ridgeway Farms, Evelyn was in the middle of overseeing a shipment when Marcus approached, his expression grim. "Miss Evelyn," he said, lowering his voice, "we've got a problem." Evelyn followed him to the back of the barn, where one of the livestock pens had been tampered with. The gate was open, and several pigs were missing. "Looks like someone did this on purpose," Marcus said, gesturing to the broken latch. "It wasn't an accident." Evelyn's chest tightened. "How many?" "3, maybe 4, Marcus said. "We'll have to check the rest of the property to be sure." Evelyn clenched her fists, her mind racing. This wasn't just vandalism, it was sabotage. She had dealt with resistance before, but this was a direct attack on her livelihood. "We'll find them," she said firmly, "and we'll fix this. Let's get the crew together and start searching." The search took hours, with employees combing the fields and nearby woods. By late afternoon, they managed to recover 2 of the missing pigs, but the others were nowhere to be found. Exhausted but determined, Evelyn called the local sheriff to report the incident. Sheriff Holden arrived an hour later, his patrol car kicking up dust as it pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, his hat tipped low over his weathered face. "Evening, Miss Carter," he said, his tone neutral. "Heard you had some trouble." Evelyn explained the situation, her voice steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. As she spoke, Holden took notes in a small notebook, nodding occasionally. "We'll look into it," he said after she finished. "But you know how these things go. Could be kids messing around, could be something else. Hard to prove anything without witnesses." Evelyn stared at him, her jaw tightening. "This wasn't random, Sheriff. Someone's trying to send a message." Holden met her gaze for a moment before glancing away. "I'll do what I can." As the patrol car disappeared down the driveway, Evelyn felt a wave of anger and exhaustion wash over her. She knew the sheriff's words were little more than platitudes. If she wanted justice, she would have to fight for it herself. That evening, Evelyn gathered her employees in the main barn. The mood was somber, the day's events weighing heavily on everyone. "I know today was hard," Evelyn began, her voice carrying through the space. "And I know some of you are worried about what this means. But let me be clear, this farm isn't going anywhere. We've faced challenges before, and we'll face them again. But we'll do it together." Marcus stepped forward, his voice firm. "You've got our support, Miss Evelyn. No one's gonna scare us off." The group nodded in agreement, their resolve bolstered by Evelyn's determination. As they dispersed, Evelyn felt a spark of hope. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone. The next morning, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor. Paulson, the town butcher, arrived at the farm, his expression uncharacteristically sheepish. "Miss Carter," he said, shifting uncomfortably, "I wanted to talk to you about what happened at the shop last week. I should have spoken up when that woman accused you. I didn't, and that was wrong." Evelyn studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you?" Paulson hesitated. "I guess I didn't want to get involved." Didn't think it was my place. And now? Evelyn asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Paulson sighed. Now I see that staying quiet wasn't right. I've been working with Ridgeway Farms for years. Your grandfather was one of the best men I knew, and from what I've seen, you're cut from the same cloth. I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Truly. Evelyn nodded slowly. Thank you for saying that. But if you really want to make things right, stand up next time. Words are one thing, action is another. Paulson met her gaze, his expression earnest. I will. Over the next few weeks, the tension in Pinewood began to ease, though the divide remained. Evelyn continued to build bridges where she could, hosting community events at the farm and reaching out to local businesses for new partnerships. Slowly but surely, more townsfolk began to see Ridgeway Farms not as an outsider's venture, but as a cornerstone of their community. One afternoon, while preparing for an open house event, Evelyn received a call from Will. I've got some good news, Will said, his excitement evident. The Pinewood Gazette wants to run a feature on Ridgeway Farms for their Christmas issue. They want to highlight the farm's history and your vision for the future. Evelyn smiled, her heart lifting. That's great, Will. Thank you for making this happen. You're the one making it happen, Miss Carter, Will replied. I'm just helping people see it. As the open house approached, Evelyn threw herself into the preparations. She wanted the event to be a celebration of everything Ridgeway Farms represented: hard work, resilience, and community. The barn was transformed with twinkling lights and festive decorations, and tables were set with samples of the farm's products. On the day of the event, dozens of people arrived, including families who had never visited the farm before. Evelyn greeted each guest warmly, her pride in the farm shining through. Paulson even showed up, bringing a group of regulars from his shop. During the event, Evelyn gave a speech, her voice steady and strong. This farm isn't just my family's legacy, she said. It's part of Pinewood's history, and I hope it will be part of its future. Thank you for being here and for supporting Ridgeway Farms. Together, we can build something stronger. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. The days following the open house at Ridgeway Farms were a whirlwind for Evelyn. Orders for the farm's products surged as more townsfolk began to recognize the quality of her work. While the open house had been a success and the Christmas issue of the Pinewood Gazette featured a glowing story about the farm, the division within the town was more apparent than ever. The farm had become a symbol, a flashpoint for debates about tradition, progress, and belonging. For some, Evelyn's efforts represented a welcome change, a breath of fresh air for Pinewood. For others, her growing success was seen as a disruption to the status quo. In the heart of town, at the old community hall, a meeting was called to discuss the upcoming Christmas parade. The event was one of Pinewood's longest-standing traditions, and this year, there was a proposal to feature Ridgeway Farms as a centerpiece float, honoring its contributions to the town. The idea sparked immediate debate. Evelyn attended the meeting, her presence at the back of the room quiet but commanding. As she listened, the divide between the town's residents became painfully clear. I think it's a great idea, said Lisa Monroe, a young schoolteacher who had recently begun volunteering at the farm. Ridgeway Farms has been part of Pinewood for generations. Evelyn's doing amazing work. Why not celebrate that? It's not about the farm, Mrs. Avery interjected, her voice sharp. It's about keeping our traditions intact. The parade is supposed to represent the town as a whole, not one person's personal project. This isn't about one person, Lisa countered. It's about acknowledging the contributions of the farm and the Carter family. Isn't that what the parade is for? Celebrating what makes Pinewood special. Murmurs rippled through the room, some in agreement, others muttering dissent. Evelyn stayed silent, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. Tom, the elderly farmer who had defended Evelyn at the diner, stood up and cleared his throat. I've been part of this town longer than most of you, he began, and I've seen a lot of changes over the years. Some good, some not so good. But I'll tell you this, Henry Carter built that farm from nothing. And now his granddaughter is carrying on that legacy, against odds most of us wouldn't have the guts to face. If that's not worth celebrating, I don't know what is. Applause broke out in the back of the room, but it was quickly drowned out by more murmurs. The debate dragged on for another hour before the meeting adjourned without a resolution. That evening, Evelyn returned to the farm, her mind heavy with the tension from the meeting. As she walked through the barns, checking on the livestock, Marcus approached her. "Sounded like a rough one," he said, leaning against a stall door. "It's exhausting," Evelyn admitted, her voice low. "It's like every step forward comes with 100 reminders of how far we still have to go." Marcus nodded. "You're shaking things up, Miss Evelyn. People don't like that. But you're doing what needs to be done. That's why they're so worked up. They see you making a difference." Evelyn managed a small smile. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot." In the days that followed, the debate over the Christmas parade continued to dominate conversations in Pinewood. At the coffee shop, Mrs. Avery held court with a group of like-minded residents, her voice rising as she expressed her disapproval. "She's trying to take over the whole town," Avery said, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor. "It's not enough that she's got the farm. Now she wants to make it all about her." "Is it about her, though?" Tom asked from his seat nearby, his tone calm but pointed. "Or is it about the work she's doing? The work none of you seem willing to acknowledge?" Avery glared at him but said nothing. The tension between the two factions in town was palpable, with Evelyn and the farm at the center of it all. Meanwhile, Evelyn stayed focused on the farm. She had learned long ago that the best way to silence doubt was through action. She expanded her efforts to connect with the community, hosting workshops on sustainable farming and inviting local school groups to tour Ridgeway Farms. Slowly, more people began to see the farm not as an outsider's venture, but as a vital part of Pinewood's fabric. One afternoon, Evelyn received a call from the town council. The decision about the parade had been made. Ridgeway Farms would be featured, but the council wanted to ensure it didn't overshadow other aspects of the event. Evelyn's float would need to fit within strict guidelines, and she would have to work with the council to finalize the design. Evelyn accepted the decision with measured grace, though the council's hesitation was clear. She could feel the weight of their lingering doubts, but she resolved to make the most of the opportunity. As the parade approached, the farm became a hive of activity. Evelyn and her employees worked tirelessly to prepare the float, which would feature a representation of the farm's history and its contributions to Pinewood. The float was simple yet striking, with a model of the farmhouse surrounded by miniature livestock and fields of crops. Will stopped by the farm one afternoon to check on the progress. He whistled as he approached the float, his expression impressed. "You're really going all out, Miss Carter." Evelyn smiled. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." "Mind if I take some photos for the paper?" Will asked, pulling out his camera. "Go ahead," Evelyn said. "Just make sure you get my good side." Will laughed, snapping pictures as Evelyn posed playfully beside the float. For a moment, the tension of the past weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of pride and accomplishment. The day of the parade arrived, and Pinewood was abuzz with excitement. The streets were lined with families, children clutching cups of hot cocoa as they waited for the floats to pass. Evelyn stood near her float, her employees gathered around her. The float was a testament to their hard work and dedication, and Evelyn felt a swell of pride as she looked at it. As the parade began, the crowd's reaction to the Ridgeway Farms float was mixed. Some cheered enthusiastically, their voices rising above the music and chatter. Others clapped politely, their expressions neutral. A few remained silent, their disapproval evident. Evelyn focused on the positive, waving and smiling as the float made its way down the main street. She spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Marcus, Will, Lisa, and even Tom, all of them beaming with pride. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a sense of belonging, however tentative. That evening, as the parade wound down and the town settled into the quiet of Christmas Eve, Evelyn returned to the farm. The barn was warm and peaceful, the animals resting in their stalls. She stood in the doorway, her breath visible in the cold air, and gazed out at the fields. She thought about her grandfather, about the legacy he had entrusted to her. She thought about the challenges she had faced and the battles still ahead. And she thought about the people who had stood by her, their support a steady light in the darkness. As the stars twinkled overhead, Evelyn felt a quiet certainty settle over her. Ridgeway Farms was more than land and livestock. It was history, resilience, and hope, and it was hers to protect, to nurture, and to share. The weeks following the Christmas parade brought a sense of renewal to Ridgeway Farms. The float had been a modest but symbolic success, and while the town was far from unanimous in its support, the cracks in the old prejudices were beginning to show. More and more townsfolk visited the farm, curious to see what Evelyn had built and to buy products directly from the source. Evelyn was finally seeing glimpses of the community she'd long hoped for, but she also knew this newfound progress was fragile, a seedling that needed careful tending if it were to survive. One cold morning in early January, Evelyn stood in the barn's office, reviewing the year's financial reports. The numbers told a promising story. Sales had increased by nearly 30% since she'd taken over, thanks in part to the publicity generated by Will Harris's articles and the open house. Yet, the challenges of running a farm remained ever-present. Repairs to the barns, feed costs, and equipment upgrades would require careful planning. Marcus entered, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Morning, Miss Evelyn. You're in here early." Evelyn glanced up from her papers and smiled. "Morning, Marcus. Just trying to get ahead of the year." "Well, I've got some news that'll brighten your day," Marcus said, setting the mug down on her desk. "We've got a new distributor interested in our hams. One of those fancy grocery chains over in the city. They called this morning." Evelyn's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "A city distributor? That's big." "Big money, too," Marcus added. "If it works out, we'll be set for a while." Evelyn nodded, already thinking through the logistics. Expanding into the city market would be a significant step forward for Ridgeway Farms, but it would also mean more work, more risks, and more scrutiny. Still, the opportunity was too good to pass up. "Let's schedule a meeting with them," she said. "I want to make sure we're ready for this." Later that day, Evelyn received an unexpected visit. Paulson, the town butcher, pulled into the driveway in his old pickup truck. She watched from the kitchen window as he climbed out, holding what looked like a basket. "Miss Carter," Paulson said, removing his hat as she greeted him at the door. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Evelyn said, though her curiosity was piqued. "What brings you by?" Paulson held out the basket, which was filled with an assortment of baked goods and preserves. "My wife put this together. She wanted to thank you for the work you're doing at the farm. Said it's about time we showed some appreciation." Evelyn blinked in surprise, touched by the gesture. "That's very kind of her. Thank you." Paulson hesitated, then added, "And I wanted to say, I've been thinking about what you said at the shop, about standing up when it matters. I haven't always done that, but I'd like to start. If there's anything I can do to help, anything at all, you just let me know." Evelyn smiled, her initial skepticism softening. "I appreciate that, Mr. Paulson, and I'll hold you to it." As winter turned to spring, Evelyn threw herself into preparing the farm for its next big event, a spring open house and farmers market. The idea came to her after hearing from customers who wanted more direct access to the farm's products. She envisioned an event where local vendors could join Ridgeway Farms in showcasing their goods, creating a space for the community to gather and support one another. The planning process was intense. Evelyn and her employees worked tirelessly to organize the event, reaching out to local artisans, food producers, and musicians to participate. Marcus took charge of logistics, while Evelyn focused on spreading the word. One evening, as Evelyn sat at her desk drafting promotional materials, Will Harris stopped by with a copy of the Pinewood Gazette. "You made the front page again," Will said, handing her the paper. Evelyn glanced at the headline, "Ridgeway Farms to host Spring Market, a growing legacy." She couldn't help but smile as she read the article. which detailed the event's goals and the farm's continued impact on the community. "Thank you, Will," she said sincerely. "You've done so much to help tell this farm's story." Will shrugged. "The farm tells its own story. I'm just here to make sure people hear it." The day of the spring market arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze. The farm was transformed into a bustling hub of activity, with vendor booths lining the gravel paths and families wandering between displays of fresh produce, handmade crafts, and baked goods. The air was filled with the sound of live music and the laughter of children playing near the hay bales. Evelyn stood near the entrance, greeting visitors as they arrived. She noticed a mix of familiar faces and newcomers, a sign that the farm's reach was growing. Among the crowd, she spotted Lisa Monroe, the schoolteacher, chatting with Paulson and his wife. Nearby, Tom sat with a group of older residents, his voice carrying as he told a story about working with Evelyn's grandfather. The sight filled Evelyn with pride. Ridgeway Farms had always been part of Pinewood's history, but now it felt like part of its future as well. As the event continued, Evelyn took a moment to walk through the market, checking on vendors and chatting with visitors. She stopped by a booth run by a young couple selling honey and candles. "This is beautiful work," Evelyn said, picking up a jar of honey. "Thank you," the woman replied, her smile bright. "We're so grateful you invited us. This is the biggest event we've ever done." Evelyn nodded. "I'm glad you're here. That's what this is about, bringing people together." Toward the end of the day, Evelyn gathered everyone near the main barn for a brief speech. Standing on a small platform, she looked out at the crowd, her heart full. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady. "Ridgeway Farms has always been more than just a place to grow crops or raise livestock. It's a place where hard work and community come together. My grandfather believed in this farm, and I believe in it too, not just for what it is, but for what it can be. Together, we're building something stronger, something better. Thank you for being part of that." The crowd erupted in applause, and Evelyn felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt not just respected, but truly embraced by the community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in a warm golden light, Evelyn stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching as the last of the vendors packed up their booths. Marcus joined her, a satisfied grin on his face. "That was something, wasn't it?" he said. "It was," Evelyn agreed, her voice tinged with awe. "I never thought we'd get here." Marcus nodded. "You've worked hard for this, Miss Evelyn, and it shows." Evelyn smiled, her gaze drifting over the fields. Ridgeway Farms was thriving, not just as a business, but as a symbol of what was possible when people came together. The spring market had been a resounding success, and the energy from the event lingered in the air for weeks. Evelyn Carter could feel a shift in Pinewood, subtle yet undeniable. Ridgeway Farms was no longer just a plot of land on the outskirts of town. It was becoming a symbol of progress, resilience, and community. Still, Evelyn knew the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges. There were pockets of resistance, people who clung stubbornly to the past and refused to see the value in change. But for the first time, Evelyn felt that the tide was turning. Slowly, Pinewood was starting to come together. One crisp morning in May, Evelyn was in the barn overseeing the loading of a new shipment of hams destined for the city. Marcus stood nearby, clipboard in hand, double-checking the inventory. "Looks like everything's in order," Marcus said, handing the clipboard to Evelyn. "This distributor deal is really paying off." Evelyn nodded, satisfaction evident on her face. The partnership with the city grocery chain had been a turning point for Ridgeway Farms, bringing in steady income and expanding the farm's reach. It was a far cry from the uncertainty she'd faced when she first took over. As the truck pulled away, Evelyn turned to Marcus. "You know, none of this would have been possible without you and the team. You've stuck with me through all of it." Marcus tipped his hat. "We believe in you, Miss Evelyn. Always have." Meanwhile, in town, the atmosphere was growing warmer. Conversations about Ridgeway Farms had shifted from skepticism to admiration. Evelyn's dedication and the farm's undeniable success had won over many of her former detractors. At the local diner, Mrs. Avery sat with a group of friends, her tone unusually thoughtful. "I have to admit," she said, stirring her tea, "that spring market was something special. I bought some of those honey candles. They were lovely." Tom, seated at a nearby table, chuckled. "Told you so. Evelyn's the real deal. Henry would have been proud." Mrs. Avery nodded slowly. "Maybe I was too quick to judge." Despite the growing acceptance, Evelyn still encountered moments of tension. One afternoon, she attended a town council meeting to discuss plans for a community garden. The idea, proposed by Lisa Monroe, was to transform an unused lot in the center of town into a shared space where residents could grow fresh produce. Evelyn fully supported the project and had even offered to donate seeds and supplies from Ridgeway Farms. But not everyone was on board. "This town's fine the way it is," grumbled Mr. Carlyle, his arms crossed. "We don't need more changes." Lisa, seated next to Evelyn, spoke up. "It's not about changing the town. It's about improving it. A community garden would bring people together." "And who's going to take care of it?" Carlyle retorted. "These things always sound nice in theory, but they end up being more trouble than they're worth." Evelyn cleared her throat, her voice calm but firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Carlyle, I've seen firsthand what happens when people come together for a common goal. Ridgeway Farms isn't just surviving, it's thriving, because of the community's support. This garden could do the same." The room fell silent for a moment before Tom spoke up. "I say we give it a shot. What's the harm in trying?" The council ultimately approved the project, though not without grumbling from Carlyle and a few others. As Evelyn left the meeting, Lisa turned to her with a grateful smile. "Thanks for backing me up," Lisa said. "Any time," Evelyn replied. "We're stronger when we work together." The community garden became a beacon of collaboration. Residents from all corners of Pinewood came together to clear the lot, build raised beds, and plant the first crops. Evelyn spent weekends at the site, sharing her agricultural expertise and working alongside volunteers. The garden quickly became a place where old divisions began to dissolve. One afternoon, Evelyn noticed Mrs. Avery kneeling by a bed of tomatoes, her hands covered in soil. She approached cautiously, unsure of how the older woman would react. "Mrs. Avery," Evelyn said with a polite smile, "those tomatoes are coming along nicely." Mrs. Avery looked up, her expression softening. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I didn't think I'd enjoy this so much, but it's good work." "It is," Evelyn agreed, "and it's good to see everyone pitching in." Mrs. Avery hesitated, then added, "I owe you an apology. I wasn't fair to you when you first came back to Pinewood, but you've proven me wrong." Evelyn's smile widened. "Thank you, Mrs. Avery. That means a lot." As summer approached, Evelyn decided to host a farm-to-table dinner at Ridgeway Farms. The event would showcase the farm's produce and celebrate the progress the community had made. She envisioned a long table set up under the stars, with fresh dishes prepared by local chefs. Planning the dinner was a massive undertaking, but Evelyn relished the challenge. She worked closely with Lisa, Will, and other volunteers to coordinate the menu, decorations, and invitations. The response from the community was overwhelming. Nearly every seat was reserved within days. On the evening of the dinner, the farm was transformed into a magical setting. Strings of lights hung between the trees, casting a warm glow over the tables. Guests arrived dressed in their best, mingling and laughing as they sipped on cider and admired the farm. Evelyn stood at the head of the table, her heart full as she looked out at the crowd. These were the people who had supported her, challenged her, and ultimately helped her build something extraordinary. As the first course was served, Evelyn raised her glass for a toast. "To Pinewood," she said, her voice steady. "To this farm, this community, and the work we've done together. May we continue to grow, to learn, and to build something we can all be proud of." The guests clinked their glasses, their voices ringing out in agreement. After the dinner, as the guests began to depart, Evelyn found herself standing near the barn with Tom. The older man had been a steadfast supporter, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude for his unwavering faith in her. "You've done good, Evelyn," Tom said, his voice filled with pride. Real good. Thank you, Tom, Evelyn replied. I couldn't have done it without people like you. Tom nodded, his gaze drifting toward the fields. Your grandfather would have been proud. Evelyn smiled, her eyes misting. I hope so. As the night grew quiet, Evelyn stood alone in the fields, the stars above her twinkling brightly. She thought about how far she'd come, from the uncertainty of taking over the farm to the triumphs and trials of the past year. Ridgeway Farms was no longer just her inheritance. It was her life's work, a testament to her resilience and the strength of the community. The lights from the farmhouse glowed softly in the distance, a beacon of warmth and hope. Evelyn knew there was still work to be done, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had reclaimed her place in Pinewood, and the future felt brighter than ever. The following winter, Ridgeway Farms stood blanketed in a soft layer of snow. The fields, now dormant, stretched peacefully beneath a pale gray sky. Inside the farmhouse, Evelyn Carter sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea warming her hands as she gazed out the window. The year had been transformative, not just for the farm but for the entire town of Pinewood. The Christmas season had arrived again, bringing with it a renewed sense of community. Last year, Evelyn had fought to be recognized, to prove her place in a town reluctant to accept her. This year, the warmth and belonging she felt were undeniable. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Evelyn had been busy planning another open house at Ridgeway Farms. This time, the event would feature not just her own products but contributions from local artisans and vendors, a testament to the partnerships she'd forged over the past year. The response had been overwhelming. The open house was set to be the largest event the farm had ever hosted, drawing people from Pinewood and even neighboring towns. Evelyn saw it as a celebration not just of her success but of the community's progress. On the morning of the open house, Evelyn walked the farm's grounds, ensuring every detail was in place. Strings of lights twinkled around the barn and farmhouse, their warm glow cutting through the cold air. Vendors set up tables laden with baked goods, handmade crafts, and jars of preserves. A small stage near the barn had been erected for carolers, and the scent of spiced cider wafted from a nearby booth. Marcus approached her, his breath visible in the frigid air. Everything's looking good, Miss Evelyn. Crowds already starting to gather. Evelyn nodded, her excitement tempered by nerves. Let's make it a day to remember. It already is, Marcus said with a grin. You've done something real special here. By midday, the farm was bustling with activity. Families wandered between booths, children ran through the snow, and carolers filled the air with holiday songs. Evelyn moved through the crowd, greeting guests and soaking in the festive atmosphere. It was a far cry from the tension of the previous year, when her presence had been met with skepticism and doubt. She spotted Mrs. Avery near a table of baked goods, chatting warmly with Lisa Monroe. Paulson and his wife were nearby, laughing with Tom as they sampled slices of Ridgeway ham. The sight brought a smile to Evelyn's face. These were the moments she had worked so hard to create. As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn took the stage to thank everyone for their support. The crowd quieted as she stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady despite the emotions welling inside her. Good afternoon, everyone, she began. I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for being here, for supporting Ridgeway Farms, and for believing in what we've built together. This farm has always been more than a business. It's a part of this community. And this year, I've seen just how strong this community can be. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. My grandfather, Henry Carter, always said that a farm is only as strong as the people who surround it. He believed in this place, in its potential, and in the people who call Pinewood home. Today, I see that potential coming to life. Thank you for making it possible. The crowd erupted into applause, and Evelyn stepped down, her heart full. She was met by Tom, who clasped her hand tightly. You've done good, Evelyn, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This town's better for having you here. Thank you, Tom, Evelyn replied, her voice soft. That means the world to me. As evening fell, the farm grew quieter, the crowd thinning as guests returned home. Evelyn stood by the barn, watching as the lights twinkled against the darkening sky. Marcus joined her, his usual grin replaced by a look of quiet pride. "Looks like we did it," he said. Evelyn nodded. "We did. And it's just the beginning." Marcus chuckled. "You've been saying that all year." "Because it's true," Evelyn said with a smile. "There's always more to do. But nights like this remind me why it's worth it." Later that night, after the last vendor had packed up and the lights had been turned off, Evelyn sat on the porch of the farmhouse, bundled in a thick blanket. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She looked out over the fields, the snow-covered land stretching endlessly beneath the stars. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the challenges, the doubts, the moments of triumph. Ridgeway Farms wasn't just a legacy she had inherited. It was a legacy she had built upon, expanded, and shared. It was hers now, fully and completely, and it stood as a testament to the power of resilience and community. A light flickered in the distance, and Evelyn realized it was coming from the farmhouse kitchen. Will Harris was still inside, finishing an article he'd promised to write about the open house. Evelyn smiled, grateful for the friendships she'd formed over the past year. People like Will, Lisa, Tom, and Marcus had become more than allies, they were family. As the farmhouse lights dimmed and the farm grew silent, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of stillness. The year had been one of growth, healing, and hope. Pinewood wasn't perfect. There were still barriers to overcome, still minds to change. But the progress was undeniable. For the first time, Evelyn felt truly at home. Not just on the farm, but in the town that had once felt so unwelcoming. She had claimed her place, not through force or defiance, but through hard work, grace, and an unwavering belief in herself and her community. With a deep breath, Evelyn rose from the porch and headed inside, the warmth of the farmhouse embracing her. Christmas was just around the corner, and she couldn't wait to see what the next year would bring.